Help for the Chicos. Bibi could no longer hold back the tears. She shivered all over from the cold and fatigue. She pulled her legs up and wrapped her arms around her knees. But that didn't help much. Only when Tina took her friend in her arms did it get a little better. They remained motionless together. Bibi had her eyes closed. Above her, the wind howled with unbridled strength. The rain whipped across the pusta grass, and at the edge of the forest, the tops of the trees bowed in every direction. Bibi didn't know how long they had been sitting there like that. She had lost all sense of time. If only the storm would stop, she thought. While the two girls held each other close, a miracle occurred. The first thing Bibi felt was warmth on her skin. Where did it come from? Had the sun appeared for a moment? She blinked and opened her eyes. All around her it sparkled and glittered. Raindrops flashed on the stalks of pusta grass in the glistening light of the morning sun. "Tina!" cried Bibi, unable to believe her own eyes. "The sun is shining!" Now Tina looked around too. She held her hand in front of her eyes to shield them from the blinding light. The heavy dark storm clouds had moved further west. Above Bibi and Tina was nothing but the blue summer sky and a shimmering rainbow, arched from one end of the valley to the other. But what took Bibi's breath away was a sight she had never expected. Horses were grazing by the narrow river, not far from the rock where the girls had set up camp. It was not a wild herd, but one guided by men in dark blue garments who appeared to be leading them. In the midst of the group, she discovered someone who made her heart stand still. It can't be, she thought. He can't be here. So close, and we didn't even notice him? No, it was impossible. She had to be mistaken. That boy with the dark curly hair over there couldn't be the one she thought he was. But when Snowball jumped up, barking joyfully, and ran to him, there was no doubt about it. It was Mikosh. "Tina! Bibi stammered. "Yes," laughed Tina. "I saw him too. Go say hello to him." Bibi was unstoppable. She shot up and ran through the rain-soaked grass down to the river. Snowball had reached Mikosh by now and was jumping on him. "Snowball!" Mikosh was completely amazed. "What are you doing here? Did you follow me all the way here?" When he looked up and saw who else came running across the meadow, his mouth dropped open in disbelief. He stared at Bibi, awestruck. He ran the last steps toward her, took her in his arms, and whirled her around in a circle. "Unbelievable!" he shouted. "Bibi, is it really you?" "Hey, I'm getting dizzy," Bibi laughed. Mikosh put her down again, but held her in his arms for a while longer. Bibi felt as if all the disappointments, efforts, and horrors of the last few days were falling away from her as Mikosh whispered something into her ear. "I couldn't stop thinking of you, Bibi. I missed you so much." A little while later, Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh sat together on the meadow in the warm morning sun for breakfast. The Csikós camp was not far from where the two girls had pitched their tent. The horse herders had also sought shelter from the storm in the lee of some rocks, and that was why Bibi and Tina had not seen their tents last night. Snowball lay happily in the grass at the feet of the three friends. He had wolfed down a huge portion of the dog food they had brought with them, and then curled up, full and satisfied. Tango, Masha, and Baboshko grazed close by near the riverbank. The horse herders, who had greeted Bibi and Tina warmly, knew that the friends now had a lot to tell each other and did not want to disturb them, so they retreated to their camp. Mikosh was surprised that Alex was not with them, so Bibi and Tina told them what had happened. Mikosh learned that Tina's boyfriend had a similar problem to his own, even though Alex couldn't run away from his father. Bibi remembered Janosch's message for Mikosh. When Mikosh heard that Janosch was ready to talk about everything, he nodded but said nothing more about it. He first wanted to hear what Bibi and Tina had been through since their departure from Falkenstein. They told him about the train journey, about their arrival at the stud farm, and all those good and bad signs that Andreas wanted to see. Bibi took out of her saddlebag the one good sign that Snowball had discovered on the first day of their ride to Hordobaji. "Here, this is yours." Mikosh beamed when he saw his pocket knife in Bibi's hand. "Amazing!" he shouted. "I can't believe you found it." Without a knife, he told the girls, a horse herder was lost in the wilderness. He thanked Bibi, Tina, and Snowball, and after carefully putting the knife away, the two friends continued their story. Then Mikosh told them how he was doing. He apologized for not having sent a message to the girls, but in the puszta there was neither mail nor a telephone connection. From Hordabaji, he had wanted to write a letter to Bibi and Tina and send it to the stud farm, but because the chicos had left very early in the morning, this simply wasn't possible. By that time, we had long since left the stud farm, Bibi said, and now you've told us everything anyway, a bit late, but still. No, I haven't told you everything. Mikosh suddenly became very serious. In Hungarian, he shouted something to the horse herders, and 3 of the men came over to them. They were in their early 20s and spent most of their time in the fresh air, on horseback. Their faces were sunburnt, and they had the athletic build of skilled riders. They wore the typical outfit of the horse herders, as Mikosh explained to the girls. Dark blue, baggy trousers, a coat made of a light blue fabric with golden buttons, and a wide hat with a curved feather. The 3 sat down with them and introduced themselves. The oldest of them was called Bela. He was the leader of the group of chicos that Mikosh had joined. The second of the herders was Bela's brother, Jasper, and the third was called Janosch. He led another group that had wanted to meet Bela here in the valley. But last night, a few hours before the great storm, something terrible had happened. Janosch had not wanted to take the path through the forest, but rather to enter the valley from the north over a hilltop. Before they reached the hill, a group of policemen in an off-road vehicle had approached them and told them to stop. They had treated the chicos like criminals, claiming that was exactly what the herders were. "They took you for criminals?" Tina asked, taken aback. "What did they say to you?" "They claimed we were poachers," replied Janosch. Mikosh snorted, outraged. "The chicos, of all people! No one loves nature as much as they do." "Yes, but we get blamed for all sorts of things again and again," Bela said. "If there's a break-in somewhere, we are the ones to blame. Or if a cow has disappeared from a pasture somewhere, it means we stole it." Bibi and Tina remembered what they had heard about the chicos. Above all, they remembered how Janosch had complained about them. "It's simply because of how we chicos live," Jasper explained to them. "We have no fixed abode and lead a completely free life in the puszta. That scares a lot of people." "But what are you being accused of this time?" Tina asked. Janosch reported that, for a few days now, wild horses had been disappearing in this area. Not horses from the herds that the chicos were herding, but animals living in the wild. Vacationers had allegedly seen 2 chicos capture wild horses and lead them away, probably to sell them to horse breeders for a lot of money. The description that the vacationers had given of the chicos applied to 2 men from Janosch's group, and these 2 were arrested and taken away by the police. "I know those 2, Janosch affirmed. "They would never do such a thing. Besides, they have been with us all the time. There's no way they could be the poachers." Mikosh was also firmly convinced of that. He wanted to help Janosch and the others to prove the 2 chicos were innocent. With Bibi and Tina's help, it would be even easier, he said. Bela, Jasper, and Janosch looked at the 2 girls questioningly. How could they help them? "They are both great riders," Mikosh said. "And besides, Bibi is no ordinary girl." Mikosh explained to the 3 horse herders that Bibi was a witch and had often rescued them from dangerous situations. "Is that true?" Bela asked excitedly. "You are a witch? Does that mean you can just make the missing wild horses reappear?" But Bibi had to disappoint him. The problem could not be solved so easily because she had to know where the horses were. "But we will help you prove your friend's innocence without magic," she promised. She already had an idea. "First, we should look for clues," she suggested. "Do you know where the wild horses have disappeared to?" asked Tina. Janosch nodded. According to the vacationer's account, the chicos had captured them in the plain at the northern edge of the forest, not far from the place where the 2 horse herders had been arrested. "Let's have a look there," Bibi suggested. "I'm sure we'll find something." Mikosh was also quite confident that the search would be successful. "You'll see, Janosch," he said. "With the help of Bibi and Tina, we'll find the real poachers. Your friends will soon be free again." On the poacher's tail. They left shortly after. Janosch rode ahead, followed by Bela and Jasper. Behind them, Bibi rode Tango and Tina Masha. Mikosch brought up the rear on Mikosh, with Snowball running at his side. Like a good herding dog, he would run to the front every now and then to make sure that everything was all right. The group kept close to the edge of the forest and followed the small river on the left bank. At a shallow spot, the riders crossed the riverbed and rode onwards to a narrow path that curved up the mountain. From the top of the hill, they had a wide view in all directions. The valley stretched out to the south and eventually merged into the plain of the puszta. To the west lay the dark green impenetrable canopy of leaves topping the forest that Bibi and Tina had crossed. On the other side of the hill was a valley, into which they rode after a short rest. The riders soon reached the edge of the forest. Janosch stopped at the place where the two chicos had been arrested. He explained to the others that the policeman's car had come over from the valley. Afterwards, they had traveled north with the two horse herders, where the nearest police station was located in a small village. The ground of the puszta was damp after the rain, and puddles had formed miniature lakes across the lower-lying areas. Bibi and Tina clearly recognized the tire prints of an off-road vehicle in the scattered patches of mud. But that was the only trace they could find. The group decided to ride along the edge of the forest and look for additional prints on the ground. Without warning, Snowball started barking. He had come across a herd of wild horses grazing not far away at the edge of the forest. The horses lifted their heads anxiously and looked around. A strong brown stallion threw his neck up into the air and whinnied. He was clearly the leader, signaling the others that danger was near. At once, the whole herd broke into a canter and fled with thundering hooves out onto the puszta. "For some reason, the animals are nervous," said Jaspar. "When I think of the jeep with the men we saw out here yesterday, they have every reason to be," Bibi said. Janosch heard this remark and wanted to know everything about these men in the jeep. He gave Bibi and Tina his undivided attention, concentrating on every word when they described Steve, Carl, and Johnny in more detail. His face darkened. "We've met those guys before," he said. "They weren't hunting wild horses, but they were racing way too fast through the puszta." Janosch and the other chicos had approached the men. They had told them that the puszta was not a racetrack, but the men had only laughed and even been insulted. "Yes, now it all makes sense," Bibi said thoughtfully. "Didn't you wonder who those vacationers were who described the two chicos so precisely to the police?" A light suddenly went on for Janosch. Only Steve, Carl, and Johnny could have been the ones who told the police. Not only had they taken revenge on the chicos, but if they were the poachers, then the men had successfully diverted all the attention from themselves. Unfortunately, no one could prove it. "Speak of the devil," Jaspar murmured, his focus fixed at a small point on the horizon, which was moving at high speed towards the group of riders. "That's the jeep!" Tina cried out. "Come on, let's get them!" shouted Bela as he dashed off on his horse. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh and the other riders followed him at a wild gallop. At Janosch's signal, they fanned out and rode in a line next to each other. This must have been a frightening sight for the three men, as the imposing riders left no doubt that their goal was the car in front of them, and that they were determined to intercept it. At full speed ahead, the group reached the jeep and circled around the vehicle. Steve did not even try to turn the car around. He stared at the riders with his mouth agape and slowed the car to a stop. Snowball had not been able to keep up with the rapid pace of the riders, but quickly joined them in the catch, growling and flashing his teeth around the car. "So we meet again," called Janosch, firing an angry look at the men in the jeep. Carl and Johnny turned pale with disbelief, but Steve recovered after a short moment and pretended to look confused. "Have we met before?" he asked casually. "We had the pleasure the other day," Janosch said coolly. "Shortly after that, you made two of my people look guilty in front of the police for something they did not do." Steve just shrugged his massive shoulders. "I have no idea what you are talking about. Do you, Carl? Johnny?" "Nope," Carl just muttered, and Johnny shook his head. "Then you probably don't remember chasing a little filly yesterday either," Bibi intervened. That caught the three of them completely off guard. "How do you know about that?" Carl snapped before getting a strong elbow knock from Steve. Steve, who had looked at the other two girls with a frown, gradually began to see how he knew them. "Ah, no," he remarked. "Ginger and Blondie from the train. How nice to meet again out here in beautiful nature." At this remark, Mikosch snorted contemptuously. Beautiful nature, as if you even cared. Please, please, protested Steve, making an exaggeratedly hurt face. Don't be so judgmental. We would never say that the chicos are prowlers and thieves, right, Carl? Johnny? No way. Only yesterday when we went to the police, Carl babbled mindlessly, but was rudely interrupted by Johnny immediately afterwards. We're peaceful, nature-loving travelers, he smiled, searching for his buddy Steve's approval with a poorly attempted angel face. Exactly, Steve affirmed. And now that we've cleared that up, I'd like to ask you to clear the way. How dare he even try to talk his way out of this, Tina whispered sneeringly into the ear of her friend Bibi. Janosch realized that he could do nothing more. He glared resentfully once more at Steve and then rode aside. With only the slightest pressure from their thighs, Bela and Jaspar also ordered their horses to walk as the group of riders slowly started moving again. Bibi was the last in line. She suddenly noticed that her left stirrup had loosened during the wild gallop. She stopped and bent to the side to strap it on. Johnny, Steve, and Carl didn't seem to notice that she was still nearby. As the jeep began rolling, Bibi picked up a few more exchanges between the men. We'd better move our nightly activities down to the valley, said Johnny. Another nighttime thing like that again? Carl moaned. But first we're going to get some sleep. Sure, Carl, said Steve and stepped on the gas, so Bibi couldn't understand a word. But what she had heard was enough. She hurried to catch up with the others and quickly told them what she had overheard. Everyone agreed that the three men in the green jeep could only have meant the hunting of wild horses when they had said, nightly activities. With police patrols and horse herders wandering through the pusta, poaching in broad daylight seemed to have become too dangerous for them. They must have been talking about the valley where we saw the other herd earlier, Mikosch thought aloud. The friends decided to lie in wait around the valley basin at night. They'll get the biggest surprise of their lives, cried Bibi. If those guys are hunting wild horses again, we'll catch them in the act. Escaped. The horsemen returned to the camp and told the other chicos what they had learned. They ate an early supper together and discussed how they would catch the poachers during the night. Almost all the horse herders would be present. Only Jaspar would stay at the camp and guard the herd. They would take up their positions around the valley, and as soon as the men appeared in the jeep to commence their hunt, the group would surround them so that Steve, Carl, and Johnny could no longer deny their misdeeds. When they set off, Janosch again led the group. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch would lie in wait below the hilltop. Bela would ride further east and stay on their side of the valley basin, while all the others would cross the valley and spread out over the group of hills on the other side. Mikosch discovered a hollow that served as an excellent hiding place. From the edge of the hollow, the three friends watched the other riders. Bela could no longer be seen. The other chicos had reached the bottom of the valley by now and had ridden past a herd of wild horses grazing peacefully at the southern edge. When they noticed the strangers, they whinnied nervously, but quickly calmed down again. The valley fell silent as the sun set. The friends still saw a purple stripe of light on the horizon. Then it was pitch black. Only when the moon rose behind one of the hills could the three friends see something down in the valley again. The herd of wild horses had moved a little further west, but the men in the jeep were nowhere to be seen. Those three guys are taking their time, Tina thought. One look at the luminous numbers on her wristwatch showed her that it was already approaching midnight. Hour after hour went by, but the jeep never showed up. The three friends wondered whether Steve, Carl, and Johnny had changed their minds, or had they postponed their trip for another night. Snowball sprang up, breaking the quiet of their thoughts. He raised his head, perked up his ears, and listened. A howling sound rang from over the hill behind them. Is that a wolf? Tina asked worriedly. Mikosch calmed her down. He had often heard wolves howling before, but this one sounded different, more like a human imitating a wolf. Still, he had trouble keeping Snowball quiet, who wanted to answer the canine call. Footsteps and the clatter of hooves approached. A man appeared at the edge of the hollow. In the bright light of the moon, the three friends recognized Bela, who had dismounted and was now leading his horse by the reins. Did you hear the howling? He asked softly. That was Jaspar. He wants to tell us that there's danger, down at camp. The three friends were alarmed. Danger in the camp? What could that be? Bela suspected that it was not wild animals, but people that Jaspar was warning about. And was it not obvious that they were the ones who'd been making trouble in the area the last few days? You mean it's Steve, Carl, and Johnny? Mikosch asked. Of course, Bibi stepped in. That's why they didn't show up here. By valley, they didn't mean here, but the neighboring valley. Mikosch suggested they ride back to camp with Bibi and Tina immediately. Bela should inform the other chicos and follow the three friends as soon as possible. The three rode out of the hollow and further up to the top of the hill. Snowball ran ahead and led them to the path that wound down into the valley on the other side. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch kept a close watch for the poachers. Something seemed to be going on at the end of the valley. The sound of thundering hooves carried through the wind. They slowed their horses to a trot when they reached the foot of the ridge. From here, they saw the cluster of rocks where the camp was located. Jaspar came running towards them excitedly. At last, you're here, he shouted. They're over there. The men with the jeep. They're hunting wild horses. He pointed down the valley towards the silhouettes of the majestic animals. The horses stormed closer and the ground vibrated under their hooves. The roar grew louder and louder. It was a whole herd of them, whinnying in panic and fleeing up the valley, directly toward the Chicos' camp. Tango and Masha scraped their hooves restlessly while Baboshko tensed and neighed, infected by the fear of the wild herd. The three friends struggled to keep their horses calm as the wild animals charged closer to the camp. Snowball whimpered and tucked his tail. Masha took a few steps back as Tango began to rear. Mikosch had leaned far forward and whispered reassuring words into the trembling Baboshko's ear. Only when the herd had raced by did the horses relax again. The friends could still see the wild horses galloping through the river and disappearing into the distance. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch peered in the direction from which the herd had come. Two red lights flashed at the end of the valley, the taillights of a jeep. Not only could they hear the hum of the engine, but also the desperate neighing of a horse. They've got one of the wild horses, cried Tina in horror. They had to race after it. Maybe they could still manage to catch up with the jeep. If they rode at full gallop, they might have been faster than the car, but also faster than Snowball, and they didn't want to do this without his help under any circumstances. He could help them with his amazing nose in case they lost the trail. Mikosch jumped off Baboshko's back. Snowball seemed to know what he was up to and looked at him with his big doggy eyes. I know you don't like it, but unfortunately it's gotta be done, Mikosch said apologetically. He lifted Snowball, got a running start, and before the dog knew it, he was sitting on the horse's back in front of Mikosch. Go, Baboshko, cried Mikosch. The girls gave a light kick of the heels, bringing Tango and Masha to a trot. Good luck, cried Jaspar after them. The friends dashed across the steppe at full gallop. Straight as an arrow, they headed for the taillights that flashed before them on the pusta grass. But no matter how fast they rode, the green jeep seemed to keep its distance. Baboshko, run! Mikosch cheered his stallion. He held the reins only loosely with one hand, as Baboshko knew his rider well and reacted to even the slightest command. With the other hand, Mikosch gripped Snowball tightly. At first, the dog kept his head tucked low between his paws. His courage steadily grew, however, and went from barely peeking over Mikosch's arm to finally shoving his muzzle into the wind, tongue flapping wildly. The strip of light on the east side of the valley had become brighter. The moon had faded from the morning sky, but it would take a while before the sun had risen over the hills. The landscape still lay in twilight. All of a sudden, the three friends noticed that they could barely make out the headlights. Mist rose from the dewy grass and sheets of fog rolled in from over by the small river. Visibility became increasingly poor. The friends saw the red lights flashing one last time before the fog swallowed any trace. We have to ride more slowly, cried Mikosch. But we'll lose the jeep, Bibi interjected. It was no use. It was far too dangerous to gallop in this fog. Bibi could barely even see the others. They had no idea if they were still heading in the right direction, and they hadn't seen the jeep for quite a while. They stayed close together so as not to lose sight, eventually slowing their trot to a walk. By now, the fog was so thick that they couldn't even see the grass under the horses' hooves. It's enough to drive you mad, cursed Tina. Maybe the jeep's already gone in another direction and we're riding further and further away from it. The three friends stopped, hoping to hear the engine of the jeep, but the only sound remaining was the soft ripple of the little river. "It's no use anymore," sighed Mikosh. "They got away from us." The Poachers' hideout. "No," protested Bibi vehemently. "We won't give up that easily." Tina and Mikosh turned to her, confused. Before they could even ask what she was up to, Bibi held out her hands and shouted, "Eeny, meeny, stallion's gate! Tire tracks illuminate! Whiz, whiz!" With a pling, pling, sparkling stars circled around Bibi's fingers and whizzed out into the mist. "That won't help," Tina remarked disappointedly. "Have you cast a spell on yourself, Bibi?" At first, the spell didn't seem to have worked, as no one noticed any change in their current predicament. But suddenly, Mikosh pointed to a spot behind Bibi and Tina. "There! I think I see something," he cried. Behind the two girls, a low light began to illuminate the fog. The three riders turned their horses around and approached carefully as it grew brighter and stronger with every step. In the tall grass, the jeep's tire tracks lit up like glowing puddles thanks to Bibi's spell. Now it was easy to follow the trail. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh could only move slowly in the thick fog, but they were sure to be on the right path. After a short while, the mist had cleared even more. The sun had risen in the meantime, and the three friends were more than grateful to feel its warmth on their skin. For most of the journey, they had been riding in a southerly direction. Now, the trail bent into a wide arc towards the west. The fog had continued to rise, and through patches in its overlay, the riders could see thick, mossy tree trunks off to their right side. As the grass beneath them wore thin and the ground more rugged with rocks, the glowing tire tracks became more and more difficult to see. Until, finally, they disappeared completely. Only a few splashes of light remained on the stony earth before the three riders realized that they had lost the tracks for good. This time, Snowball came to their aid. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh had just stopped their horses when the dog raised his head, jumped off Babushka's back, and ran over to the edge of the forest. Barking wildly, he paced up and down in front of a bush, and when the friends followed him, they saw that, behind its solid green cover, a narrow path led into the forest. Snowball was unstoppable as he took off down the small trail. At a trot, the friends rode after him. The fog had also cleared in the forest, but only a few rays of sunlight could penetrate through the dense canopy of leaves. Again and again, Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh had to duck in front of the low-hanging branches and creepers to keep Snowball in sight. Thorny bushes lined the roadside, and the three wondered where he was leading them. Suddenly, the dog stopped. His neck fur was ruffled, and he growled from the deepest depths of his throat. Between the thick tree trunks, they saw a clearing where a log cabin stood. Bibi held her breath as she spotted the green jeep parked in front of the entrance. Next to the hut was a small paddock. Some wild horses were standing there crowded together and whinnying miserably while Steve, Carl, and Johnny were about to lead in another horse. The mare resisted with all her strength, but the three men pulled and tugged at the lasso, whose noose had been tightly wound around the neck of the wild horse. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosh carefully dismounted, took their horses by the reins, and crept closer to the cabin. Tango, Masha, and Babushka were nervous, and when Steve, Carl, and Johnny now drove the captured mare into the paddock with a whip and raw blows from a baton, they could barely contain their own urge to neigh loudly. "Take it easy," the friends whispered to their horses. They were now so close that they could hear the three men. Hiding behind a bush, they saw Steve slam the paddock gate with a, "There we are. It's really cool that we found a buyer for the horses," Carl said, grinning nastily. "Then we'll have enough dough again for a trip even further east," laughed Johnny. At that moment, Bibi could no longer hold on to herself. "It won't work anymore," she cried angrily and came out of hiding with Tango. Tina had walked around the bushes with Mikosh and the horses and gave the three men an angry look. "So we caught you, you dirty poachers!" The men were taken completely by surprise. Johnny had his eyes wide open. He puffed up his cheeks in amazement, looking very much like the toad Bibi had nearly turned him into on the train ride. Carl's jaw hung open, locked in disbelief, while Steve's face turned a bright candy red. He was the first to find his words again. "So, did you catch us?" I don't see how a pusta boy and 2 girls can possibly stop us." He gave his 2 pals a nod to follow him to the jeep. But Carl and Johnny were still so flabbergasted that Steve had to give them both 2 good blows with his elbow. "Come on, let's get out of here," he drove at them, and only then did they stumble hastily towards the car. Bibi reacted with lightning speed. The 3 of them simply could not be allowed to escape. "Eeny, meeny, poacher fat! Blow the rubber tires flat! Whiz, whiz!" she shouted. No sooner had she uttered the words than the blinking resounded and sparkling little witch stars rushed over to the car. With a tremendous bang, all 4 tires burst at the same time. Steve had already opened the driver's door, while Carl and Johnny had run around the back of the car. At the sound of the blast, however, the men froze in place, stupefied, staring in disbelief at the flattened tires until Carl lost his footing and fell head first into the mud below the jeep. If that wasn't enough, the 3 hunters were in for an even bigger shock. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch could also hardly believe what was happening. A muffled rumble echoed through the forest, and the ground trembled under their feet. Wearing wide-brimmed hats and dark blue uniforms, a group of riders came storming up on horseback. It was the Csikós. All those whom Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch had lain in wait with in the valley had arrived. Janosch was ahead of them. In a massive cloud of dust, they galloped to the small clearing in front of the cabin and lined themselves up threateningly in front of the 3 poachers. At that moment, Steve, Carl, and Johnny finally gave up. After the Csikós had arrived, Steve, Carl, and Johnny made no more attempts to escape. Janosch had galloped to the next police station, and the other Csikós, Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch, had guarded the 3 men until Janosch had returned with the police. The wild horses in the paddock had been proof enough, and Steve, Carl, and Johnny now had a lot of explaining to do. Together with the Csikós, Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch brought the wild horses back to their herds, where they were welcomed with happy neighing and prancing. The 2 horse herders, who had been arrested by the police only days before, were released with sincerest apologies. At last they had arrived in the valley and joined the others in the cozy warmth of the campfire. "Now tell me," Mikosch impatiently urged Bela. "I don't think Bela has to explain it at all," said Tina. "I know how the Csikós found us." "Really?" Bibi wondered. "How did they find us?" "You of all people should ask that?" cried her friend, laughing. "You brought them to us." Bibi didn't understand. "How so? I still don't get it." Mikosch suddenly jumped up. "Of course! The Csikós followed the tracks that Bibi had lit up." Bela recounted how Jaspar had told the others in the camp that Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch had followed the poachers. The Csikós had followed them, but without the glowing tracks, they would certainly have never found them. When the tire prints had disappeared into the rocky ground, Janosch had remembered a nearby cabin in the forest, which was occasionally rented to vacationers, and they had ridden there on a hunch. So once again, everything had turned out for the best. "Almost everything," muttered Bibi as Bela finished his story above the crackling of the campfire. "Only almost?" Mikosch asked. "What still got you down?" Bibi looked at him quietly, and now he understood what she was getting at. "You want to know if I'm going back to Szendrö?" Bibi nodded. The next morning, she and Tina would ride back to Elizabeth and Hortobaji as promised. But would Bibi's friend be there too? Mikosch sighed. "To be honest, I haven't decided yet whether I want to go back. But one thing is clear. Whatever I decide, Bela, Jasper, and I will accompany you to Szendrö Stud. Then I'll have a few days to think it over." Mikosch's decision. Bibi, Tina, and Mikosch had an early morning breakfast with the Csikós and then packed their things. Janosch said goodbye to the 2 girls. He thanked them for their help. Without them, they would probably not have been able to prove the innocence of the 2 horse herders so quickly. When the 3 friends left together with Bela and Jaspar, the Csikós waved at them for a long time until they reached the narrow path that led through the forest. The sun was already high in the sky when the riders reached the plain on the other side. It seemed ages ago that right at this same spot, Bibi had saved the foal from the 3 poachers. They reached Hortobaji in the early evening. Elizabeth was beaming when the riders arrived. She took Bibi and Tina in her arms and greeted Mikosch, Bela, and Jaspar with heartfelt kindness. Elizabeth's house was too small to accommodate so many visitors, but the chicos assured her that they preferred to sleep outside anyway. They camped in the garden together with Mikosh, while Bibi and Tina moved back into the guest room. For dinner, they all gathered around the big farmer's table, where Elizabeth surprised them with a sumptuous welcome meal. When everyone had had enough, Elizabeth thought it was high time to call Szendrö stud, and Mikosh wanted to be the first to do it. Elizabeth's telephone was in the hall, and although Bibi perked up her ears, straining to listen, Mikosh spoke too softly for her to hear anything. Bibi wouldn't have understood anyway, because they were speaking Hungarian. When Mikosh returned to the table, he looked contemplative. Bibi was bursting with curiosity and wanted to know what he had talked about with Janosch. She followed Mikosh out into the garden, where they sat down on a bench under an apple tree. At first, Mikosh didn't want to say anything, but Bibi wouldn't let up, and finally, he told her that the conversation had been surprisingly peaceful. Mikosh had feared that Janosch would scold him because he had run away. Instead, he had remained calm and had asked Mikosh to return home. Janosch had given up the idea of sending him to Budapest, but he still insisted that Mikosh should get a proper education. "That's also quite reasonable," Bibi encouraged. But Mikosh shook his head irritably. "No one understands me. When I see Bela and Jaspar, I see a free life out on the puszta. It makes me want nothing else but to ride off on Babashko." Bibi understood this very well, but realized that further words could do nothing. The decision Mikosh was about to make, he had to make all by himself. In her farewell the next morning, Andreas's sister took Bibi in her arms for a long time and whispered to her that everything would surely be all right. Mikosh was still reserved and thoughtful. He rode last in the group and even fell back several times, which Snowball did not tolerate. He barked loudly each time until the boy had caught up with the others. When they came to the abandoned windmill in the evening and made camp for the night, Mikosh went to bed early. The next day, he was just as unresponsive as ever. Without interruption, the group rode on up to the hill, at the foot of which was the small oak grove with the clear spring. That evening, Mikosh did not eat with the others. From the campfire, Bibi saw him climbing a hill. He was looking to the south, where the Szendrö stud farm was located. But then his eyes wandered more and more towards Hotobaji, and even further east, to somewhere far beyond the hills where the valley with the Csikós camp was located. "Boys always find it so hard to decide," moaned Tina, who had not failed to notice where her friend was gazing. "It's not an easy decision," Bibi defended Mikosh timidly. But Tina stuck to her opinion, and she even went one further. "And then they can't even talk about what's going through their heads." Mikosh would have to make a decision the next day at the latest. Either he returned with Bibi and Tina to Szendrö stud, or he rode on with the Csikós to the eastern puszta. Bibi didn't like the last possibility at all, and the thought that Mikosh could join the horse herders forever worried her the entire night. At breakfast together the next morning, she barely managed to take a bite. Bibi was just as silent as Mikosh when they loaded their horses and set off from the lovely campground by the oak grove. The last venture through the plains seemed endlessly long for Bibi. They finally reached the hill where the girls had taken their first rest on their outward journey. Here, the group made another stop. The air was hot again, as in the days before the heavy storm. The sun beat down mercilessly from the sky, and its rays flickered over the puszta. Tina stared dozily out onto the plain. When a figure appeared in the haze, she thought she was dreaming. A horseman approached, whom Tina would never have imagined. "It can't be," she murmured. "It must be a mirage, a delibab." "A mirage from Falkenstein? Here?" replied Bibi. She had noticed the rider as well as Mikosh, who now jumped up and waved. "Alex!" he cried. "That's Alex!" Tina couldn't believe it. It was really him. He took off up the hill at a gallop. He'd barely stopped when he jumped out of the saddle and rushed up to Tina, taking her in his arms. "But how—" Tina stammered. "How did you get here? What are you doing here anyway?" Stop, Alex laughed. "One question at a time." As it was time to leave, Alex waited with his report until everyone had mounted their horses. As the group started to move, he began to tell his story. The lessons with his private instructor had not been as bad as he had first feared. They had made rapid progress with the material. In the end, Alex had done so well in a re-examination that Count Falco von Falkenstein had allowed him to travel to Szendrö Stud. "But when I arrived yesterday, none of you were there," Alex remarked. Janosch had told Alex the whole story about Mikosch and how Bibi and Tina went looking for him, and he had decided without further ado to meet them the next day. The evening before, Alex had also talked to Janosch about the idea of school, which Alex was convinced Mikosch should attend. Together, they had finally come up with an idea of a place close to home. There was a secondary school in Csikós, and if Mikosch went there, he could always be with the horses in the afternoon. Janosch had been enthusiastic about this idea. After all, Mikosch was needed at Szendrö Stud. "Well, Mikosch," Alex asked, "what do you think of it?" Bibi felt everything knot up in her stomach. That was it, the moment of decision. But if Bibi thought that this would enlighten Mikosch, she was in for disappointment. The only thing he said was, "Yeah, that's all right." It took Bibi quite a while before she understood what that answer meant. "That means," she began cautiously, "you're staying at Szendrö?" Mikosch nodded and smiled. "Somehow I belong there too, don't I?" Bela and Jaspar regretted Mikosch's decision. They could have used an excellent rider like him as reinforcement, but they also thought it was the right thing for him to finish school first. "Who knows?" said Bela with a wink. "Maybe you'll still be drawn out into the wide, wild puszta afterwards." "In any case, you are welcome with us any time," Jaspar added. Bibi hardly noticed the words of the two chicos. She was elated. What she had longed for so much had now come true, and from now on, everything would be as wondrous as it had ever been. In her well of happiness, she didn't even hear Mikosch yelling over to her. Suddenly, all their horses took off with a gallop. Bibi knew that Mikosch could only have shouted one thing. "Whoever gets to Szendrö Stud first!" She drove Tango and chased after the others. "Giddy up, Tango!" cried Bibi. But Mikosch, who was riding at the very front, could not be caught. He reached the stud farm first, followed by Bela and Jaspar. Bibi, Tina, and Alex arrived almost simultaneously. Mikosch had just dismounted Babushka when Janosch came out of the stable. When he saw Mikosch, his face lit up. "My boy!" he cried, and ran to Mikosch, taking him in his arms. Tears came to his eyes, and he murmured, "I'm so glad you're back home." Mikosch was touched. He didn't say a word and just nodded. He released himself from the hearty embrace and introduced the two chicos to Janosch. Janosch hesitated a moment. Then he took a breath and reached out his hand to the two horse herders. "Thank you," he said, "for taking such good care of my boy." "Mikosch can take care of himself very well," said Bela with a smile, "but it was an honor to have him with us." "Well, Janosch," whispered Mikosch, "I'll bet you don't think the chicos are so bad anymore, do you?" Janosch could not hide his embarrassment. He muttered something about, "That wasn't meant that way," and, "Actually, I never had anything against the chicos," before turning to Bibi and Tina to thank them as well. Bela and Jaspar wanted to say goodbye, but Janosch wouldn't allow it. He invited them to stay overnight, which the two chicos gladly accepted. They pitched their tents on the meadow in front of the stud farm. "And now," Janosch announced, "we'll celebrate with a bonfire, singing and dancing." While Bibi, Tina, Alex, and Mikosch unloaded their saddlebags and took care of their horses, Janosch and the two chicos piled wood for a campfire. Andreas also joined and helped them. Before long, the crackling flames blazed high into the evening sky, over which Andreas hung a kettle with Janosch's best homemade stew. After the friends had enjoyed their meal, Bela sang an old folk song, accompanied by Jaspar on the cymbalum. The tones of the Hungarian zither sounded both joyful and melancholic. Bela's song was about the old Magyars, who roamed the puszta on their horses. Janosch joined in the singing, and after Andreas had also sung a verse, he began to dance. He clapped along with the rhythm. Janosch stomped his foot, and the two of them jumped around the fire with a wild, "Hey, hey, hey!" Not even Mikosch could sit still. He took Bibi by the hand, and before she knew it, Mikosch twirled her around to the sounds of the cymbalum. Tina and Alex also danced along. They didn't know the lyrics of the song any more than Bibi did, but during the chorus, everyone joined in the cheerful, "Hey, hey, hey!" laughing, dancing, and celebrating the end of their mighty adventure under the glowing stars of a deep night sky.